Comics podcast.
We like
Comics
because they have no home.
I'm Joe Getcho,
And I'm Mike White.
and welcome to a post-apocalyptic episode set in the distant future of We Like Comics because they have no bones.
Yeah, even though it looks sort of verdant and green behind
Yeah.
you, so it doesn't look that bad.
The colors are cheerful, but the content is very post-apocalyptic.
Yeah, as you guys will see. So thanks everybody for joining. If this is your first time listening, we are a clean comic book podcast that celebrates all things DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, IDW, and more. Each episode, we take a comic book or comic-related media and review it, taking you on an exciting adventure to learn more. One of the other things you'll notice about our podcast is that it's a clean show. So we'll try to keep it appropriate for all ages, even though our story today is rated M for mature. And you can visit the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or the ESRB website, at esrb.org for more information about this rating. For more comic book discussions, you can also follow us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube, and at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter.
Yep, got to get those disclaimers out of the way. And make sure you check us out on the web at bonelesscomicspodcast.com, where you can find links to our episodes, as well as our after shows, bonus content, of course, Spidey Joe's one-shots on YouTube, which I need to get back to doing, and our Amazon store, where you can purchase any of the comics we've reviewed on our show, which is also a great way you can support our podcast while also adding your favorites to your collection. Check it out. Leave us a message letting us know what you think.
Yeah, I have a question about that. With the one we're doing today, this is a free webcomic, right? So
Very
I don't
true.
think they can buy this one.
No, I
because
don't think so. But we'll
it
take your
doesn't
money
cost
anyway
money.
at bonelesscomicspodcast.com. All right. So yes, today's comic is a bit different. It's an online comic. So in 2010, the video game publisher Square Enix partnered with the DC Comics imprint Wildstorm to create a 3-issue comic series with a sneak peek for gamers into the dark mythology behind the action RPG NieR, which was released in Japan under the name NieR Replicant for the PlayStation 3 and under the name NieR Gestalt for the Xbox 360. Both games are based in the same world, have the same premise, and are only different in regards to the protagonist's appearance, his familial relationships, and the year the game takes place. The North American and European versions were the same as Japan's NieR Gestalt, the name shortened to just NieR, and released on both Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. The comic, however, was written by Ricardo Sanchez and was based on the Gestalt version. And God bless you. We'll get into the differences between those two. We'll get into the differences between those two a little bit later on. So for the writer, Ricardo is a fiction and comic book writer for DC Comics. He's written Legends of the Dark Knight, Teen Titans Go, Resident Evil, Line of Defense, End of Nations, and another comic based on a video game, Rift, which is, I think, PC only and is an MMO, which I have played years ago. He wrote a short story called Death and Life of the Hero, which appeared alongside 9 other short stories in a graphic novel, Gods of Justice, published by Cliffhanger Books, which is a company dedicated to helping talented people find a place to share their vivid tales of imagination. So that's kind of a neat little tidbit that there's, short story publishers out there. So if you're looking and getting into writing, that's one way. But, he's written a lot of DC comics, so I don't think he needs to do that, but it's probably something he enjoys to do.
Yeah, so I think a trend that you're going to notice as we talk about the creators is that they have all done lots of licensed properties, and they have all worked at Wildstorm specifically on that imprint. So I'm going to very quickly go through all 3 pencilers because we do have a different penciler for each of the 3 issues in this collection. But just know that these all seem to be fairly experienced creators that have specifically done even video game adaptations. And so we'll get into what those are. But the first penciler, Carlos de Anda, is best known for his work on Dark Horse's fan and critically acclaimed Star Wars series, which was followed by success on Wildstorm's Deathblow and DC's Arkham City, which is also a video game adaptation. He also worked on DC's Bionicle title based on the Lego toys of the same name, and its sequel title, Hero Factory, as a cover artist. His style is very reminiscent of the 90s superstar Joe Madureira, which he's kind of one of the artists that's credited for bringing manga influence into American comics. specifically with the X-Men books in the 90s. So that if you kind of know what his look is, or actually if you played the Battle Chasers video games, I think he's the main designer for those. So you may have seen his art out there. But the next artist is the only one that I actually was familiar with before reading this comic, and his name is Pop Mon. And he took over penciling duties on Teen Titans in 2016 after the initial penciler, John Boy Myers, quit after only 2 issues. So he began his professional career at Wildstorm Comics and mentored under the legendary Jim Lee himself. And likely, Pop Mon is an immigrant to the United States. I don't recall specifically what country Jim Lee is from, but Mon was born in Thailand and then came to the United States at the age of 3. So during his career, he's done work for DC Comics on Batgirl, Bionicle, there's that again, Masters of the Universe, and he's also worked for Tokyo Pop, Dark Horse, Top Cow, and Marvel on a very recent title called Arrow. And that's AERO. It's not Arrow like Green Arrow. He's penciled 2 other comic book adaptations of video game properties as well, both for Wildstorm, namely the Gears of War series and World of Warcraft.
I think he actually worked with Sanchez on Rift as well, because when I was looking at his information, it had Pop Mon's name listed as well. But most notably, I think he's drawn variant covers for Amazing Spider-Man, Sensational Spider-Man, Marvel Adventure Spider-Man. So that's really, I think, the most important thing to note. Because I'm a Spider-Man fan, if you hadn't.
Yeah.
Okay,
we picked up on that. Moving on. Yeah, I mean, I like this work on Teen Titans. Didn't really care for it as much as the previous penciler, but that's a whole controversy and story that we don't need to get into here. So unfortunately, I wasn't really able to find much information on Eduardo Nunez, as he shares a name with a Dominican professional baseball player. I was able to find that he worked on another Wildstorm title called The New Dynamics. So it seems like all 3 of these artists were kind of like staff artists at Wildstorm during the time that NieR was published.
Yeah, I think that was the idea, was to take the well-knowns and have them, drop a quick little teaser before, the game release to sort of help further that along. So I was looking at the promotional material when they announced this, and actually they have him listed as Eddie Nunez. So maybe that's why you weren't really able to find him, because it said that he worked on the, at the time, soon to be released, DC Universe MMO. So I dug into this a bit, and it looks like he did indeed work with Jim Lee on doing concept design and artwork for in-game cutscenes in DC Universe Online, or DCUO for short. He also did some design work for Green Lantern, The Rise of the Manhunters video game, and some of his comic credits include working on Lois Lane and the Resistance, Deadpool, Batman / Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Nickelodeon's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Ben 10, and Legendary's World of Warcraft. So I thought that was
so we got another World of Warcraft alumni here.
And apparently he resides in Austin, Texas, working for Powerhouse Animation and hunting chupacabras on his free time.
May your hunt go well.
And it was on the internet, so it must be true.
Yeah, so I thought it was a nice touch to have a different artist for each story, but they seem to keep the colorist and the inker and the rest of the art team the same, which did make it look a little more cohesive than some stories where you're kind of changing styles drastically from one to the next. I think Daanda's art in the first issue was probably my favorite, because it, like I mentioned earlier, it had kind of that like East meets West, or that kind of like manga influenced quality to it that really kind of seems to fit an American publisher making a comic book based on a Japanese game. So I felt like that was probably the best fit, but none of them were distracting or bad or anything like that. So.
There was one, I think, well, we'll get into it later, but there's a kid in the story that they're telling, and I think there's one panel where the kid's face is just like really weird looking, and I don't know if it's because they're freaking out and this is somebody's freaking out face, or it looked really odd. There were a couple moments in the art for me that I kind of just looked at like, oh, that's kind of bizarre, but the story itself is bizarre as well, so it sort of fits there as well.
It is.
So this comic focuses on 3 protagonists whose names aren't pronounced like you would think. So our main character is supported by his traveling companions, a hot-tempered and foul-mouthed young swordswoman named Kaine, and a talking tome named Grimoire Vice, or Grimoire Vice, if you've played the games. It's interesting to note, although used in this comic, NieR actually isn't our main character's name. In an interview with the game's director, Yoko Taro, he was told to use a name for the novellas, so he used it as a compromise. But as far as the game goes, he's simply the protagonist, and asserted that NieR is the name for the series in general. So kind of interesting, and also in the game, you get to actually put a name in there for this character. And so I had been playing Dragon Quest Builders, and I had a female builder character in that game named Gwenny. And so picking up NieR for the first time, not having any idea what to expect, I put in the main protagonist's name as Gwenny, and then I was surprised when a young man appeared on the screen and his name was Gwenny. So that wasn't my intent, so it was very strange to me because that's not what I was looking to do. But after playing the game and going on the emotional ride that is NieR, I actually got attached to that name. So forever the main protagonist is Gwenny, and that's his name, and that's just how I feel about it. So I think everybody who's played it will say the same thing about the name that they used. But
so when I was making my notes, I was operating under the assumption that his name was NieR, because I am not sure that they address him by that in these issues. But that was the only thing I could seem to dig up on the internet, because I was like, how do I talk about who this character is? So that's interesting for you to say, like, well, he's actually not supposed to have a name.
Yeah. And there's another character who's important to like the overall story named Emil, but he is not featured in these issues. But I think that might have given too much away since this was released before the game came out. And he's a character that you don't encounter until, you know, right away in the game. So if you're looking for him, he's not here.
So yeah, we have NieR Kaine, which I'm glad that you showed me how to pronounce that, and Vice.
His name actually is Grimoire Vice, and it is not to be abbreviated. He is very particular about that.
My name is Grimoire Vice, and it is not to be abbreviated.
Yeah, there's a story beat in the beginning where he makes that very clear, that he's like, no, you must use my full title when you address me.
Yes.
Anyway, they are exploring ruins as they search for a powerful shade and a cure for the black scrawl sickness that NieR's daughter has contracted. As they search, the magical grimoire Vice, an anthropomorphic book, tells them the story of the evil wizard Adler, who became obsessed with immortality after the world was ravaged by the black scrawl. Adler even gained the ability to take people's souls from their bodies on his dark quest. Now, as that story isn't to Kaine and Vice's liking, Kaine resolves to tell a story with a happy ending, albeit not a happy story. She tells the tale of a warrior that challenged dozens of shades, which to me in the story looked kind of like some sort of automaton, but maybe that's just because they had armor on. But you've corrected me here and said they look like biological humanoid-like mutations. So whatever the shades look like, they're in the story that she tells, there was a warrior that was challenging them, looking for a place to die in combat. During the warrior's struggle, he discovered a little girl being besieged by the shades and resolved to rescue her no matter what. In so doing, the warrior found a new purpose in life and decided to live another day. Vice questions the validity of the story, but NieR says that at least he liked the ending better than Vice's story of death and destruction. And then finally, in the third chapter, the third issue, NieR shares his own story about his journey with his daughter, Yona, and how he slew a beast in the wilderness to bring her a beautiful flower. While he was originally hunting just to find her food, he realized she needed more than just physical food. She needed hope. So he fought an enormous guardian to give Yona a flower, which he says saved her life. And so the comic ends with NieR, Kaine, and Vice finally finding the powerful shade they were hunting through all three issues, and Vice swearing that he will help NieR find a cure to the Black Scrawl Plague and save Yona. And that's pretty much the story. It's split up into 3 issues, but the issues are only 10 pages each. So it's really closer to what like a comic book one-shot would be for something that you would purchase retail.
Yeah, and that's really how it's intended. There's not any more, as far as I know, there aren't plans to make any more, although it was fun to read, and I, without giving away the ending, I, wish there was more. So maybe someday we'll see some more, but I think they're actually making some either manga or comics for NieR Automata, which is very different from this, although kind of from the same origins. And then also there is actually a Grimoire Vice, like it's actually called Grimoire NieR, but it's I think it has like a walkthrough and, you know, pictures and everything in it, but also has some additional like background and lore and mythology and stuff for the series. And originally it was only in Japan, in Japanese, but with the remaster and everything going on nowadays, they're actually releasing an English translation with more content in 2023. So look forward to that later.
That's cool. Yeah, so you mentioned them making manga based on NieR Automata. And to me, that would make more sense for a Japanese company to go with somebody that is in their country, that is well established at making comics. I think it's really interesting that the creative decision was made to go with Wildstorm overseas for this. That's really interesting for a Japanese video game company to go, we want an American comic book company to market this, basically.
So back in 2010, it was definitely a thing to do a worldwide release on different platforms at the same time. And so there was a lot of, I mean, like years of development work and everything that usually go into a video game. And there were some changes that were made, which I'll talk about a little bit later here. But essentially, they wanted to sell this overseas and make sure it was popular, because being a Japanese action RPG, they were sure it was going to be a hit there, but they wanted to make sure the worldwide, you know, release was supported. So I think this was kind of like almost like a money grab move of, we want to create some hype. So we're just going to take our best writers and artists, or, you know, some people who at the time have the bandwidth to support this, because, you know, DC keeps people busy, to, you know, churn out a quick comic to sort of spark some interest in the game coming out. So I think that's originally why it was created. And, you know, we're looking at it, you know, from 12 years ago, judging it now, and, you know, especially after everything that's happened since then. And then also, you know, me having played the game, looking through it with different eyes than I would have originally before playing the game. So it'll be interesting to get your perspective on the differences too.
Yeah, that's something for anybody listening. Something important to note is that intentionally I have not played the game, and Joe did. I believe you platinumed it, didn't you?
Yeah.
You got all the trophies. So yeah, he's pretty well versed in this world, and I knew nothing going into this comic. And we've kind of done that on purpose to maybe show a little bit of a different perspective on things here. So
yeah, because usually we have the like similar shared experiences with things like Star Trek, and, you know, it's kind of our big one. So, you know, it'll be interesting this time with coming from different backgrounds. You know, maybe we'll come to some different conclusions and disagree for once.
You found a way to make a Star Trek reference, even in this. We've got to do it every episode.
Always, yeah. All right, so let's take a quick break, and we'll be back to jump into our story and our thoughts. All right, welcome back, everybody. So, as I mentioned earlier, the North American and European versions of the video game were the same as Japan's NieR Gestalt, but the original release on PlayStation 3 was called NieR Replicant. During development, the team believed the Japanese audience would respond more strongly to a younger protagonist, while non-Japanese audiences would prefer an adult protagonist character. So the biggest difference between the non-Japanese version released in North America and the original Japanese version Replicant, which was recently released in North America as a remaster, is that the protagonist in Replicant is actually Yona's brother rather than her father, as we see in this comic series.
Oh.
So it's kind of a big change, but it really doesn't change the game overall. But it's interesting because it kind of changes the way you view the endings of the game, because if you play the game as, you know, father-daughter versus you played it as brother-sister, you would, you know, maybe make some different choices than, you know, you would one way or the other. So it's kind of interesting. So the version that I'm used to, I played, was the remaster, which has the younger protagonist in it. So that's who I'm used to seeing. That's, you know, my Gwenny, as I said before. Whereas the, you know, older looking gentleman we see in this is definitely the Gestalt version, which I think, because he's from that version. But there's actually a free DLC for Replicant where you can play as this older gruff father figure. And there's like familiar locations and new locations. And basically it's, you know, a way to get you to fight shades. But it's kind of cool to play as that version too. So that's kind of the big difference when you hear Gestalt and replicant between the two versions. And those words are actually both used in the story, but
Oh,
not as
okay.
a way to break the fourth wall and say the name of the video game, but those are actually terms in the story.
Okay. Well, one thing I noticed about him is that he he's almost like a He-Man archetype
Yeah.
because
Hmm.
NieR looks like a big barbarian guy, and that's definitely the style of character that they were going for. So yeah, definitely not the typical Japanese RPG protagonist, because that you would expect to see. I don't know. I mean, Cloud and Squall from Final Fantasy are kind of like the two most obvious examples that come to my mind, but sort of like mildly effeminate male character
Hmm.
that comes in and saves the day, and he's still strong and everything, but they don't usually look physically huge and
Right.
buff. Whereas this character NieR in this story is a big dude. Like he looks like he could do some damage to somebody.
And that was the idea, is they thought that audiences overseas, which would be us,
Mm-hmm.
would respond better to that version rather than the, typical young Japanese looking characters. And that's
Mm-hmm.
also why his hair is white, is because they wanted him to look different. And I think the director actually calls out they didn't want him to look like every other blonde protagonist. So it's funny that you mentioned Cloud, because he's
That's
very much
funny.
a blonde protagonist. So
I, not knowing any of that coming into this, I just thought, oh, NieR is the main character. He's the barbarian guy. But my real first impression coming into the beginning of the story was that they were giving me a lot of information in like 2 pages. And so it was a lot to absorb at once. And I kind of felt like I was getting a dim picture of like the overall world or narrative that supported these characters. I mean, it was kind of like one or two throwaway lines of dialogue where they're like, we're in a post-apocalyptic world. NieR is a knight or a warrior searching for a cure for his daughter. Everyone in the world has been affected by this black scrawl disease. And the setting seemed really grim as far as like what was actually going on in the narrative, but the colors are like bright, colorful, and the art is actually really energetic. So I think that kind
mhm.
of took the sting off of the violence and the harshness of the environment a little bit.
Yeah, I think that very much describes the story. Is there's a lot of emotions involved. There are a lot of really bad things that happen. There's a lot of death. There are a lot of creatures and weird things that just look grotesque. But at the same time, there are those like very bright, colorful, energetic moments. There's a lot of like
Hmm.
character interplay and relationship and that kind of thing. So there's a whole lot of balance kind of as far as that goes. So, it's interesting because looking at this, it looks to me like it's just some sort of side adventure. Like you could probably peg in the story in the game where this took place, and it's just, they're roaming around, they're fighting shades, and they happen to, recall some stories, and it's just some, dialogue, a fun little like character piece. I'm kind of surprised that they didn't do something that gave you a little bit of history going into the game. Because like if you just play the game straight through, it's really easy. It's one of those games where you can kind of get lost as to, well, wait, what exactly is happening and how did this happen? And it's
Mm.
got such an expansive mythology that, just playing the game and going through stuff, it's really hard to miss what's actually happening, even though the game has a lot of like repetition in it, that some parts you play like multiple times. It's still
Sure.
easy to miss things, and then they start adding new layers on to the parts that you've already played, and then you have to catch, okay, what is it that's changing now? So,
Hmm.
but this is one episode where I'm going to try to stay away from major spoilers, even though technically the game's been out for 12 years, although the
Hmm.
remaster was just released last year. But the story is very rich. There's a lot of complicated twists and turns that honestly would completely ruin the story and the gameplay experience. So I want to stay away from
Oh,
those.
okay.
But I'll give, just a little bit of overview to help tie things together a bit more, which I think would have been a really nice thing to, maybe 4 issues, and the first issue kind of goes through
Hmm.
some of the history. So,
Yeah, so we do get a bit of a history lesson early on from Vice,
mhm.
who is a talking book for some reason. But that doesn't seem specifically related to the cause of the Black Scrawl. It's more just the story of how this wizard went insane searching for a way to survive it.
Hmm.
And I was almost wondering if, like, does this wizard Adler come back in the game or something? Is this some villain that they're setting up for the future? I wasn't really sure where that story was going. And I was looking more for, like, okay, well, why did the world get afflicted with this disease? Are we going to get into the cause of this? But at least the comic book itself didn't seem very interested in that. It was just kind of like, it happened, accept it. We're living in this world now, and we have to kind of get through it. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think a little more background would have really helped me, not knowing anything, to jump into it, especially if this was intended to be a product that you want to sell the video game series to somebody
Hmm.
on. It's like, well,
Yeah.
you want to give them a little bit more to go on to
Because
start off with.
when
So,
you start the game, you start in like 20, 30 years in the future or something, and you have this like, it starts to be post-apocalyptic, or it seems that way, and there's all this stuff happening, you fight some shades, and then it goes 1,000 years later, and now you're whisked away to the future, and you're like,
whoa.
well, wait, what? I thought we were 30 years in the future. Why did we jump to 1,000? And it's confusing in the game, and you kind of learn the backstory and history as you go. But I think kind of
Hmm.
there were some things that were missing, and part of it is because the story premise came from actually another video game called Drakengard that was released in 2003 on PlayStation 2. So the main story really isn't connected, but it's the fifth ending, where the game's protagonist in Drakengard travels across a dimensional boundary to fight a monstrous beast. During the fight,
Hmm.
both the protagonist and the beast are killed, and their deaths spread this magical essence across the land, which results in a devastating disease for the humans that live there, the Black Scrawl. These
Oh,
beings
so
from
that was
another,
established in another
yeah,
game?
yes.
Okay.
So that's, I think the biggest part that's missing is this came from an ending in another game that they based this game off of. And if you haven't played that other game, you're missing this entire like
Right.
setup. So the beings from another dimension didn't mix well with the humans of this dimension, which is why this, caused this. It's kind of like an Umbrella Academy where you have the mega punch from the alien boxing match, and it's like it
Oh,
sent this
yeah.
shockwave and it like did all this stuff to the earth. And if you haven't heard that episode, go back to our podcast episode for the Umbrella Academy where you can hear us talk about this. But it's kind of that thing where you have this alien stuff happening and it doesn't mix well with our dimension, and there's this catalyst that causes this event to happen, and that's where the Black Scrawl comes from. It annihilates most of the human race, and it sets up the story for NieR in the fallout of the post-apocalyptic land. And that also
Okay.
leads to the most recent entry, NieR Automata, which is set thousands of years after NieR. So we have this like, okay, we have Drakengard, and then 1,000
Wow.
years later we have Replicant or Gestalt, and then 1,000 years after that we have Automata. So they're like related, but they're not sequels.
Yeah, it's like it's taking place in the same universe, but they're not
Mhm.
directly linked story-wise, I guess.
Right.
So that actually cleared up another question that I have had, which was how does this link to the more popular Automata game? But
Mhm.
I guess I know that now. So yeah, this is really just the first couple pages that we get the quick history lesson, and we're introduced to Kaine as well, who is probably the crassest female protagonist that we've encountered in any of our reviews. In fact, maybe one of the crassest characters in anything that we've read since we started the podcast. Her hyperbole and her language are not for the under 17 crowd, especially towards the end of the story when she uses a very colorful metaphor.
There's
She
a Star
also
Trek
is,
reference again.
yeah, colorful metaphors. There you go. She's also wearing high heels, which seems not super ideal for fighting monsters in like a post-apocalyptic hellscape. So, I mean, I guess just Japanese character design. That's why. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Well, and that's kind of also why she's missing several key elements of clothing, which don't seem
Right.
like, for the harsh climates and, for fighting and all that stuff would be very practical. But,
Mm,
that was the way that she was designed. So, that's the way that she is in the game and, of course, in the comic.
I was watching years ago, and I just thought of this because something you said. I think the director's commentary. Yes, I've watched director's commentaries on movies. I wish they would do that more. But I think it was the first or the second Appleseed movie, the like CG anime movie.
Hmm.
And I remember the director talking about they had a conflict with localizing it because they were like, well, you have to explain why this happens in this scene. And the director was like, well, it doesn't matter. It looks cool. And that's within the Japanese storytelling, that's fine. As long as it looks cool, you don't need to explain it. So I think that has something to do with their storytelling sensibility too, where it's like you are just supposed to accept it, whereas our understanding of stories and narrative and things like that, we want an explanation for everything a little bit more. So
I think you kind of have both. Like you have that, well, this is just the way it is, accept it. And then you have the like expansive mythology where we could write like 20 books and have 10 video games and have, 5 feature-length movies because we have so much mythos that we tried to cram into, a 50-hour video game that you can't possibly get every tidbit out of it because there's little footnotes in parts of items that you get that if you don't read the subtext of the item that's a rare drop, you might not get this background, piece that's going on. So that's really much where this fits in, is everything has a reason for why it is that way, but there's so much. It's just like a vast story
that makes me think of Xenosaga. I think was the series that we were into back in the day, where the mythology behind it and all the terminology that you had to learn just to understand the story was a big barrier. It was an enjoyable story once you got into it, but there was a lot of you almost had to like study up on what you were reading to understand it. So this, you're saying this is one of those game worlds where there's just so much to it that they couldn't possibly cram it all in.
Yeah.
That makes me kind of put another strike against this book for not explaining more than, because I feel like with the comic, you have an opportunity to flesh out backstory in a way that maybe you only have 30 pages, but maybe you could get into some stuff that they didn't have time to include in the game or something like that. So,
and that, I think that would have been better. And maybe if they went the manga route and or had Japanese writers, they could have done that. But it seems like with this comic, they wanted to stay away from repeating anything that was done in the game and really just show you like touching character moments. I mean, there's, violence and death and that kind of thing. So it's loosely touching, but they wanted to show those character interactions and just like, well, this is the kind of ride that you're in for. But at the same time, using that comic medium, I agree, that would have been a good place to really expand on the backstory. Like you said, tell things that, do give us a little connective tissue between Drakengard, or even just give us a comic that retells the 5th ending from Drakengard, so we at least can see the story, because I never even heard of that game to even play it. So I had no idea going into this that, anything was based on that, but that little bit of backstory helped, sort of shed light on things.
Yeah, there were, I think there were 3 of those games, if I remember correctly.
The third one came out after NieR.
The first one is kind of famous for having basically all the characters that you play as have like no redeeming qualities to them whatsoever. And I guess the director, what was it, Yoko Taro, he was trying to make something that was sort of like the anti-Japanese RPG. And so I guess that was the idea, was he's like, instead of making it all about a group of friends that come together, it's going to be a bunch of jerks that nobody likes that end up, saving the day, that are just terrible people. But I think from the little bit of research I've done online that maybe they went too far with that, because some of the character stuff that I've read about them, I'm just like, wow, I do not want to play this game. So it seems pretty dark, pretty depressing, and not an experience that I want to have. So I think NieR is going to be more up my alley as far as that goes. But
yeah, there's some things that happen that, kind of border on depressing, but it's one of those things like it's part of the story. It's not the overall story. And so, there are good character moments, and the characters really are enjoyable, and they're not jerks. And, Kaine, like, she's very foul-mouthed and she's very abrasive, but she also has a kinder side that she tries not to show. So there are a lot of layers to the characters in this that I think really help, make it more enjoyable than just like, your typical, oh, the world is ending and everybody's sick and everybody's dying and there's no hope left and that sort of thing. But So the comic and the game do both have that M mature rating. And originally, you take one look at Kaine and you're like, well, that's why, because of the way she talks, the way she dresses, that kind of thing. But actually, there was an interview with the director where he corrected the interviewer and said, no, it's the graphic stabbing scenes and blood, which led to the game's mature rating. So there is a lot of
Really?
even with the shades, there's like blood flying out of them in the game. So this is definitely not, a game for the faint of heart. And like I said, even though Kaine seems crude and violent on the surface, she does have a kinder side. And we get a little bit of that in this comic where she rescues a girl from the shades, but she doesn't want anybody to directly know that it was her, because she doesn't want to show that she actually stopped to rescue somebody. So she makes it based on some guy, some warrior did this, and he was really mean and that sort of thing. But I think if we saw the actual events, we would see maybe a little more sympathy from her. But she's definitely one of those characters that's like, I'm here with you, I'm with you till the end, let's take care of this. Hey, if you're in trouble, I'll help you. And then at the end, it's okay, well, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and let's go. Just that abrasive, all right, let's move on.
Well, I mean, I think she even drops multiple F-bombs during just this comic. I was just a little bit shocked by it, because I was like, whoa, what am I reading here? Like, I didn't expect that. The DC Black Label stuff that they do now would have uncensored profanity as well. But in your typical comic book, you've usually got, like a hashtag and a question mark and an @ symbol, something like that to censor it. So,
well, it's funny because it's definitely like that in the game. Like if you go to play the game, it's going to be not just F-bombs, but just the most creative use of swear words strung together, directed at, friends and family and that kind of thing. That's just, that's the way that she talks. But it's funny because actually in the Japanese versions, they use a censored beeping noise for her Japanese profanity, which was actually an homage to the game's own dubbing history and a contrast to other media at the time with serious narratives. But it was considered too comical by localizers for the English versions. So that was abandoned. So we get to bear the full brunt of her vulgarity.
So it's funny because her language and her metaphors are so over the top that I still thought it was funny, because some of the things she says are just like, how did you even come up with that?
Right.
Like, that's horrible.
Well, so, and they address it in the game too. Like there's a lot of comments, there's a lot of dialogue while you're roaming the fields of them talking to each other. And it's very much that kind of thing, especially Vice. He's very judgmental about the way that Kaine dresses in the game. He calls her a hussy. And, he's like, I'm sure you have some, thing. Can you say it without swearing? That kind of thing. And there's a lot of funny dialogue, about her swearing. So there's definitely a comical aspect to it.
There was a little bit of that in this story. I think just when she began her story, maybe Vice said something to the effect of like, oh, can you get through it without, swearing or something like that. And she clearly didn't. But I did think it was interesting that they're just like, this guy is a magical book. He talks, and just accept it. That's how things are.
Well, actually, he is a magical tome. How dare you address Grimoire Vice like some common paperback?
How dare you address me like some common paperback?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He's a tome. I guess that carries a little more dignity than the word book.
That's right.
I don't know. So just, again, I'm trying to piece together what's going on in this world. I'm like, okay, so there's magic of some kind. If he's a magical grimoire, that must mean that it's kind of commonplace because everybody's talking to him like, oh yeah, it's a talking tome. Yeah, that's totally normal. And I did feel like they had a good dynamic between the three characters. It was kind of, I don't want to say an anime trope, but definitely archetypes that I recognize. Like there's the strong silent warrior, the sassy female character, and then sort of the wise old sage character. And then they kind of have conflict and play off of each other while they're traveling. So, I mean, it didn't feel like it was forced or it was over the top or they were throwing it in your face that they were kind of tropey, but I definitely recognized like the archetypes that they were going for there. And NieR, I think, is probably the most generic to me just because any like video game or anime that has like a heavy character, that carries like a big sword or whatever, like Gladiolus in Final Fantasy, or Orin, or kind of the serious, wizened old swordsman character is like NieR. So he was the one that I really was like, he's kind of just like a stock character, although him fighting for his daughter did give him a little bit more of like a level to operate on. So
yeah, it's really interesting that they were trying to, not necessarily do the status quo, but in changing the character from a young boy and then later an adult in the replicant version. The version that they gave, North America and Europe was a more like standard stock kind of, so instead of a stock Japanese, young person, now we have a stock, like American burly, like giant sword character. So they sort of went from one to the other. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Grimoire Vice, because I don't know if it's, in one of those like items that you have to read in the game or where exactly, but I put together his history because it's actually interesting and again feeds into the main story, and would have been kind of nice to see some of this like retold, because I don't think it's like super spoiler. It just sort of sets up the character that you're going to hear. So Grimoire Vice, he was actually born as a human male. So he did not start off as a tome or a book or a sheet of paper, and learned to walk and then, became a book or anything like that.
Sheet of paper that grew into a book.
So he
fell into some ink, and then there were like words on him.
You got to be careful where you fall.
That's right.
Got to throw the Spider-Man references in there. So there is magic in this world, obviously. Kaine actually uses magic, but she doesn't have like a grimoire or anything to do that with. So the ways that magic is used is, different depending on, who's using it. But anyway, so this sort of ties back to the like Adler's experiments, because they're, again, over 1,000 years before the events of NieR, that's actually when Weiss was born. When he was 10 years old, he was taken into the Hamelin organization, named after the Pied Piper of Hamelin, and trained as a child soldier against the monsters of Legion. At age 16, he defeated the Legion leader named Red Eye, and no, not the Red Eyes from Mystery Men, but a monster named Red Eye, as part of Hamelin's 13th Crusade Squad. Only 2 of the unit's soldiers survived, Weiss and an unnamed girl. At age 19, he entered a top-secret experiment to obtain an honorable discharge from the organization's forces alongside the other survivor of the battle with Red Eye. In the experiment, 13 soldiers were made to kill each other, and those who survived would be absorbed, their souls would be absorbed into magical grimoires. Weiss was absorbed into a white book. The girl was absorbed into a deep crimson book called Rubrum, and the last man standing was made into a black book called Grimoire Noir. Say that 3 times fast. Grimoire Noir, Grimoire Noir,
Grimoire Noir.
And not NieR, but Noir. And those are really the 3 important tomes to the story. So there's actually like 12 of them, but I don't think they had time to put them all into the game. So we really just focus on the 3 of them. So Weiss, and it's like his antagonist, his antithesis would be Grimoire Noir. And then Rubrum, the girl was actually made into this tome, but she's mute, so she can't talk. So she can't really explain, what's going on or what she's doing or what her motivation is. She can basically just fight, which is what ends up happening in the game.
Yeah, okay.
So that's sort of the backstory on Weiss.
Yeah, so I mean, we've really just talked about the characters a little bit here, but it is divvied up into 3 stories that are told from the perspective of each of the 3 characters. And does Adler have the Wizard Adler, which is the story that Weiss tells, does he have some direct link to Weiss? Or because it really seems like that story came out of nowhere, where he's just like, oh, you guys want to hear a story? Well, what about the one about this guy that got obsessed with surviving the Black Scrawl? So he started ripping people's souls out of their bodies. And he was like, this will be a great story to alleviate your boredom. I mean, I don't know. I was a little bit like, why did he pull that out? Like, does it have some relevance later, or?
Yeah. So as a magical tome, he does have words, scrawled on his pages, so he
Right.
is like a talking book, so he does, you know these stories that he is able to recant. So I think the idea was,
Oh, I see.
he's a storytelling book, so he's going to tell you a story. But as far as relating to the game, I don't think there's any mention of Adler or this experiment or anything. I think this is something that the comic creators came
Wow,
up
that's a
with
shame.
based on the story. But I will say that the theme about ripping people's souls out of their body, as you can tell from Vice, is actually a very important theme later in the story of Replicant. If you think
Okay.
about the word replicant and where it's been used in various movies in the past, you can kind of guess where that's going. But spoilers, I'm going to stay away from that. But I will talk about the power of words. The visuals in the game really feature a lot of symbols, and some of them are like
Okay.
runes, some of them are known languages, some of them are made up languages. And actually the vocal artist for the vocals in the game, she was able to speak many languages and obviously sing many languages. And so she actually does this in a lot of the vocal tracks where she'll sing in different languages and then she'll sing in like a made up language. So there's a lot
Oh,
of words and different languages and things being spoken. And, it's kind of like in Tales of Zestiria where they have like their, the other, well, it's not a made up language, but it's like the language of their ancient texts and stuff. And so they
yeah.
say things like Fethmus Mioma, and you're like, what the heck does
Yeah.
that mean? Things like that. So they don't really, shout the words in this, but it's more of a visual aspect. So like the menu system has word symbols all over it.
Oh,
The intro
interesting.
has a lot of like letters and stuff, not the scrolling like the Matrix, but they're,
Hmm.
just kind of appearing everywhere. So the black scrawl, which took me a while to figure out, it's really just like magical runes that are scrolling over a person's body. So it's like this like
Oh,
energy that kind of goes around your arm or something like that, and it's like these letters of this rune. And
okay.
the actual like script characters that they use to compose the black scrawl are A, C, G, and T, which represent DNA. And I don't know how to
Okay.
pronounce those, but adenine,
Adenine,
cytosine, yeah,
guanine,
guanine, and thymine. All I can think of is Sloan
tetrahydronine,
from Deep Space Nine, where he's like losing his
thymine.
mind and he's saying them over and
Yeah,
over, and
yeah,
it's
yeah.
It's a simple nucleotide marking sequence. Lidenine, what's the name? Nino and Hugh. Tyrosine.
Would you mind repeating that?
but anyway, so the black scrawl represents a breakdown of a person's DNA. And there's a
Okay.
more specific reason than that, but it's a huge spoiler, so I'm not going to go there. But it is basically their DNA is being broken down, and it has something to do with, souls being ripped out of people's bodies. And so this black scrawl is like this disease that's breaking down people's DNA and killing them.
Okay. Well, that I don't think I could have possibly picked up on
No,
from this comic book. But
even
now
from the
that you
game, it was
mention it,
hard.
I remember some panels of seeing symbols on people's arms and stuff
Hmm.
while they were being experimented on by the wizard Adler. So that then makes this feel like, oh, this is relevant to the game world.
Yeah.
But I don't think there was any way that I could have figured that out just from reading
No,
this
and even
comic.
from playing the game, it didn't dawn on me at first, and I had to go
Right.
back and like reread things and do a little Googling, that kind of thing to really piece together the whole story. Because like I said, there's a lot to it, and there's a lot of nuance and things that if you just miss one piece of it, you get another piece and you're like, what the heck does this mean? I'm completely
Right.
confused. Because
Right.
there are a lot of things that happen that, if you miss what's going on in the story, you'll just be like, why am I here? What am I doing?
Mhm. So that answers a lot of questions I had about the first story. The second story I thought was interesting because Kaine told a story about a male warrior, but the
Mhm.
visuals were clearly showing her saving a little girl from a whole bunch of shades. So you kind of answered this a little bit earlier when you were talking about her demeanor, but I was surprised that she changed even the gender of the protagonist. I guess is she the kind of person that's like really uncomfortable with like showing that, oh, I actually cared about someone, or does she have some reason to like hide the fact that she have noble intentions or whatever? That made me sort of start thinking along that track because
Mhm.
hers was the only story where it felt like she was intentionally lying.
Yeah. I view this as a a character trait because she's grown accustomed to being alone. She suffered a lot of persecution as a child, so she decided to, live only to exact revenge basically on the Shades, and really didn't have time for, anything else like being friendly or, opening up to people and that sort of thing. And especially in a post-apocalyptic world where people are
Right.
constantly dying, you're not going to get close to somebody very quickly, because then the Shades gobble them up and then, they're gone. But I kind of, looked at it more, like I said, as a character trait of she doesn't really get close to people anyway, and that sort of thing. So
Yeah, it seemed like it was an intentional choice, but it also, I wasn't sure where they were going with it. So I don't know. It was interesting because it did give us a little peek into her character, but I felt like that was it, and then it was over.
mhm,
And that, if I have one gripe with, I think, all three of these issues, I think that's probably what it is that we start to get invested in these characters, and then it's like, all right, we got to move on to the next thing. And the pacing, because it was only 30 pages, had to be so fast
yeah,
that they just had to pack so much lore into these 30 pages that it really felt not undercooked, but it just felt like there's so much more here, and we don't have time to tell you about it. And
right.
maybe that's intentional, because they're like, we'll play the game and we want you to, go buy the game. But
Yeah. Well, the
for
second
for a,
issue, I think, is very representative of Kaine's personality. Like, that's
okay.
mostly what you get for a really long time. So I don't know that they really could have done too much more in a comic, because,
Okay.
unless you're going to see the character grow over multiple issues, we don't want to, divulge the end and give you the secrets of her character yet, because
Sure.
we do get a little bit of her childhood in the game, and we start to understand her motivations a bit more. But I think she's intended to be the mysterious character who seems very angry and gruff and coarse on the outside,
Hmm.
but actually has a softer inside that's, in there somewhere beyond all this gruffness and all the swear words that she's constantly throwing at you.
Yeah, right on. It's like a Snickers bar. It's like hard chocolate on the outside, and it's got a gooey center.
If hard chocolate was swear words, then yes.
The third issue, I actually like this story quite a bit. This is the one that I felt like maybe we could have done a whole issue about just this section, because it's NieR telling a story about his life with Yona and how devoted he is to his daughter. And unlike a lot of post-apocalyptic worlds, this does feel like an unforgiving landscape, but it doesn't feel totally hopeless. And that
Mhm.
seems to kind of be a theme that they're carrying throughout with the visuals, and definitely with this story. So that kind of piqued my interest a little bit, because I was like, okay, this isn't just Mad Max, or something like that, where it's like the world has ended, let's all kill each other. It wasn't. And even though he looks like the big tough macho guy, we do get to see him like show some tenderness with his daughter. And he goes out of his way and even fights a monster in order just to give her like this little pink flower. And so that was a nice character beat to show that like there's more to him than just being the monster hunter guy that likes to fight.
Mhm.
So
And this is really the central theme to the game, is this relationship between the main protagonist, I'm not going to call him NieR, and Yona, whether it's father-daughter or
mhm.
brother-sister. This is what's central to the game. So there's all this
Okay.
post-apocalyptic stuff going on. There's this cool sci-fi story about, people's souls and being put into magical tomes and things like that. But really, we're focused on the main character and Yona, and what, their relationship, and everything that he does is motivated by her. And so that's why he goes out into the world and he fights the Shades, and he goes on side quests for the townspeople and picks up items and, those kinds of things.
Sure.
Is really, that's what his goal is. And so it's a little disjointed, because you have the story over here of what's
Hmm.
going on in the world, but we're focused on this little pocket over here with Yona and her father, brother, whichever.
Right.
And so it's a little bit different, because the things that happen in the game really make you question, like, well, that's great for them, but what about the rest of the world? Like,
Hmm.
what's going on there now?
Hmm.
So, but the various endings of the game taken on, different meanings depending on if you're viewing them as father-daughter or brother-sister, because there's multiple endings to the game, and it's one of those like you get to choose which ending you think is the true ending for the game. So they're all presented separately. And so the ending you choose is going to be different based on, if they're father, daughter, or brother, sister. But inevitably, it's the same gameplay, and it is possible to get all of the endings and watch them all. So it'll be interesting too, to decide, which do you think is the true ending? And if you let us know on yeah, exactly. And if you let us know on social media, just please be aware of spoilers, because Mike has not played the game yet. And if you start spoiling it for him, he probably won't play the rest of the game because it'll be ruined. And we don't want that. Insert sad emoji face.
It depends how fun it is. I mean, we'll see.
Yeah. I think the gameplay is really fun in addition to the story.
So, I mean, I think everybody can tell after my analysis of this that I don't want to say lost, but I was trying to sort of intuitively put all the pieces together and make this story work. So I have a lot of questions, and you probably can't answer a lot of these, but those include: when does this take place? How did these three people meet? Why are Vice and Kaine helping NieR on his quest? Where exactly is Yona? Why is Yona not traveling with them? Is she like
she's
too
in
sick?
bed?
Is somebody taking care of her, or did he just like leave her in a bed by herself? And he's like, well, you're fine. This is a problem that's over there.
If you're here when I get back, then I'll have a flower for you. If not, because I'm a big gruff character with a giant sword.
Right. But a question that I had that you already answered was what caused the black scrawl, or you kind of got into what it is at least, and that it was related to an ending from a different game, which I think is enough for me.
Yeah.
Did Vice used to be a person? That was another question that I had, and you obviously talked about that. And are talking books a normal thing in the world of NieR? So I guess based on what you said earlier, it's possible that we'll run into other grimoires that used to be people.
Yeah,
in this world.
There are three, Vice being one of them. So there are two others that we'll run into in the game, but they don't really talk about, do people just wake up one day and they're a book? Like, what is this?
That would be terrifying.
Right? So it's one of those things where there is a reason for it, but it might be buried somewhere.
You've got to cut in the no eyes, no ears, no mouth, no shape song from Tekken Tag Tournament there, when you said woke up and you're just a book. No shape.
Yeah.
All right.
So I think the composer actually did the Tekken series. Like from Tekken 2 on, maybe not every piece, but a lot of it. There was also Soul Calibur 6. There's one, I can't remember what it was called, but there's one track from Soul Calibur 6 that the composer did as well. And like, it's one of those, you listen to it and you're like, it's kind of like Danny Elfman. Like his style is very distinct. You hear it and you're like, okay, I know that that's him because of the way he uses the instruments and sort of the effects. Like he always has the strings doing this, and he always has the trumpets doing this, and that kind of thing. So I definitely recognized it with the composer.
Wow, that is awesome.
Game.
I never would have thought when I brought up Tekken that there would be an actual connection to that between these two games.
It's funny that you mentioned Gladiolus, because he actually did the music for the DLC.
Oh, really?
Gladiolus DLC, but it was just the like main theme, or the like title screen.
Oh,
so
wow,
he didn't do the whole thing, but just that part. And so I went back and listened to it, and I was like, I can really tell that that's his style. And there's like a long list of credits. It's actually pretty neat. And there's been some like collaborative stuff in various, like there was actually one in Final Fantasy 14 where there's like a bunch of raids, and they have, the music playing, and it's really good. Like if I could attend a concert with the music from NieR, I definitely would do that.
Oh, that's cool. I mean, music is, we've talked about this a lot off podcast, but that's a big thing I think that attracts both of us to the Japanese RPG genre, is usually music is something that they pay a lot of attention to and they invest a lot of effort into, and it really enhances the experience. So,
well, a shameless plug for my own YouTube channel. Check out Spidey Joe 47, where I actually did a cover of some of the music from NieR and some other games like Tales of Zestiria and things as well. So make sure you check that out. But until then, For the rest of your questions, when does it take place? I think we kind of talked about that. It seems like it's just sort of a snapshot out of time of at some point when you have these characters and you're going off on your travels, this sort of happens as part of the storytelling. So it really could fit in a lot of different places within the narrative. So I think it fits the tone of the game. They captured the personalities of the characters perfectly. Like it really fits within there. And it also, like you said, the big downfall is that they don't give you any history or explanation. And you would think for something that's trying to sell a game that they would want to tell you, here's what this is about. But instead they give you here's a day in the life of, playing this game. And then that's what the comic basically is.
Yeah. I think I'm about ready to move to final thoughts if you are.
All right, let us move into final thoughts.
We like
Comics?
because they have no home.
I am purely rating this as a comic book because I have not played the video game and I was missing a lot of information. My enjoyment of it has increased as I've talked with you, and you've kind of peeled back a few more layers of the onion, and I've started to understand what we have here. But I think the best selling point that this comic has is that it is a nice character piece. It does introduce you to 3 characters that you're like, okay, they're interesting. I would like to see a little bit more of their world and kind of what they're about. But unfortunately, there's not really enough meat on the bone here to make it feel like much of a satisfying story. So I'm actually gonna go lower than I've gone on a lot of things on this, and I think I'm gonna give it a 2.
Wow.
Because it was a functional story. It was good. It had good characterization, but there just wasn't enough time for anything to breathe, and it went through everything so quickly that I was left with more questions than answers. Maybe that's not fair. You could maybe talk me into a 2.5, because it's like, okay, well, the intention was just to sell this other product. But I really felt like the experience just wasn't complete, and that they really kind of missed the boat on it, where this was an opportunity to really get into the backstory and show this is the lore, this is the setup for the game world. And I feel like they just didn't touch on that. So
yeah,
maybe that was just my wrong expectation going in, but yeah, that's where I'm gonna go.
That's why I wanted you to go first, is to get an unbiased opinion, because my opinion is completely biased because I played the game, so I know a lot of this stuff, and it was fun to especially for this episode, dig into the lore a little bit more and understand more about it. So coming at it from that perspective and understanding the context, I'm actually going to give this a 4 out of 5. Which is on the other side of the spectrum, which I think is unheard of in our podcast up to this point.
It is.
But the reason is because from my perspective, I'm reading this comic and I'm like, oh, this is, just a snapshot out of time from this game that I played that I really enjoyed. And they got the characters right, and it was like a fun story, and they didn't like retell something that they didn't take a scene from the game and just put it into the comic and dump it in there. Like it was actually its own story. It fit within the lore of the game. It fit within the timing, because like I said, there's times where you're roaming around the fields and this could fit in, anywhere. And it made me feel like, after I've platinumed the game and I'm done and I've put it down and I'm moving on, I got to come back to the game and experience a little bit more dialogue between the characters, and it was fun. The only criticisms I would be I missed Emil because he's a really important character, but that's fine. But the actual criticisms I would have are that for something that you're trying to use to sell a video game, it just especially from your opinion, it doesn't sound like I don't know how well it did, but it doesn't seem like something that, like, why would you do this? Why would you just give, well, here's just a normal day, and people be very confused, like, oh, I want to learn more, go play the game? Because, I think this was a much better experience having understood the story and, reading more about it versus something that like, hey, are you interested in this game? Well, try out this comic first. And if you like the comic, then go check out the game. But I don't think this is really a good jumping on point. Like if you haven't played the game, haven't read the comic, I would just play the game and then come back to the comic later.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating world. I'm more excited to start the video game though than I would be to like read more comics like this, I think,
Mm.
because again, 30 pages, not a lot of real estate to cover what you've now told me is expansive lore. And
Yeah.
I think our discussion of it has given me more of an appetite to explore the world than I would have had just from reading the comic. So
I think that's what we found out of, everything that we've read that's been promotional or tied
Mhm.
to multimedia in some kind of way is that it's been very lacking. Either it was too short or it was rushed, or
Mhm.
they just didn't give you the same experience as the movie or show or whatever or game did,
Right.
because they were really just focused on, here's a story, this is what happens, boom, we're out.
Yeah, with
Rather
Ratchet
than,
and Clank, certainly.
yeah.
I
And
think Mega Man was really the only one where we came down really positive on like
I think we wanted
this.
more from that as well, though, because it was
Yeah.
still it
Yeah.
wasn't basic, but there wasn't a whole lot to it. There was enough that
Mhm.
it was like, well, this could go somewhere really cool, but instead you just told this really small story that has potential,
Right.
and then that's
Right.
it.
Yeah.
So it seems to be promotional material in general. It seems to be what they do is here's a, small little snippet that's cool. And the comic fans are like, well, I want to read more of this. Like if
Right.
they had went
Right.
into just the backstory, not even any spoilers for the game, but just the backstory and,
Mhm.
all the stuff that we covered in this episode, if they would have put that into the comic pages, I may have given this a 5. Very close, maybe a 4.5,
Wow.
because it's really interesting. There's a lot to it. And if you put it all together, it's really cool. But if it's disjointed and you get like a little bit here and there, then
Mhm.
it's really confusing and very weird looking. And you have these like, they look like robots, but they're, people or creatures or mutations or something.
I
But
mean, I was able to pick up a lot by the little dialogue that they had there. So I think that it was serviceable, but I was looking for
mhm,
something more than serviceable.
yeah.
So yeah, two out of 5 bananas, 4 out of 5 for you. That's going to
All
average
right.
out to a 3, which I think is probably fair. So
Yeah, I think so. Well, this has been a fun episode. As we said at the beginning, you can't purchase this because it's free, but we'll still take your money even if you want to. But if there are other
absolutely.
comics that you want to buy, you can check out our Amazon store at bonelesscomicspodcast.com, as well as you can find there more of our additional audio and video content. And make sure you tune into our after show on YouTube, where Mike will play NieR Replicant, the remastered version, for the first time. So we'll get some more thoughts about and discussion about that as well.
Yes, sirree. And speaking of thoughts, tell us your thoughts by posting a comment on social media at Boneless Comics Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube, and Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter. And wherever you post, be sure to use our hashtag Boneless Comics Podcast and make sure to follow, like, subscribe, and more. And tune in next time for a discussion on Hawk and Dove, Ghosts and Demons by Carl Kessel, Barbara Kessel, and Rob Liefeld.
That should be a lot of fun.
I think so.
All right. Well, until then, thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you later.
Catch you later.